Buffalo, New York, March 1942. The winter air inside the Bell aircraft factory was thick with oil vapor and the rhythm of 1,000 hammers. Riveters in stained overalls leaned over fuselage frames while sparks snapped in the blue light of welding torches. Every corner of the hangar was alive, except one. In the center, beneath the glare of overhead lamps, stood the newest pride of American engineering, the Bell P-39 Airacobra. Fresh paint gleamed along its narrow fuselage. Its tricycle landing gear rested on the polished floor like the feet of a racehorse waiting for the gate. The engine, not in the nose, but behind the pilot's seat, was hidden under panels of riveted aluminum. It looked futuristic, almost alien, and yet no one would fly it. The silence broke when a test pilot threw his helmet onto the concrete. "I'm not flying that death trap again," he shouted. The words echoed through the factory like a gunshot. He was the 5th pilot that week to refuse. The supervisors glanced toward the officers, unsure whether to argue or pretend they hadn't heard. Outside, the war raged across 2 oceans. The newspapers spoke of American courage, American innovation, but inside Bell aircraft, innovation had begun to smell like failure. To the engineers, the P-39 was supposed to be a revelation. By moving the Allison V-1710 engine behind the pilot, they had achieved perfect weight balance and made space for a 37mm nose cannon, a weapon so powerful it could tear through a tank. On paper, it was a marvel. But theory burns away fast at 10,000 feet. Pilots complained of violent vibrations running through the cockpit, a constant metallic growl from the drive shaft that linked the rear engine to the propeller up front. Precision flying felt impossible. Like sitting on a washing machine set to spin, one man wrote. The placement of the engine meant that any mechanical failure sent shrapnel and fire forward, straight into the cockpit. Then came the fatal flaw. The Allison engine gasped for air above 12,000 feet. In Europe, the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 cruised comfortably at twice that altitude. The British Spitfire soared even higher. The P-39 couldn't climb to meet them. It simply ran out of breath. One test report landed on an officer's desk with brutal clarity. Fundamentally unsuited for high-altitude interception. Sealing inadequate. Handling dangerous. Cannot be recommended for combat. The verdict should have ended the program. But America was at war, and factories could not stand still. Buffalo ran on 3 shifts, 7 days a week, assembling hundreds of aircraft that no one wanted to fly. Rows of brand new Airacobras sat in storage yards under tarps, gleaming silver coffins waiting for a war that seemed to have no use for them. The workers whispered among themselves. They had built a weapon to defend their country, and their country had already buried it. They didn't know that half a world away, another army was running out of aircraft, and another war would soon give their unwanted creation a second life. The Bell P-39 Airacobra was never meant to be ordinary. In 1938, when the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a call for a new high-performance interceptor, the team at Bell Aircraft, led by visionary designer Robert Woods, set out to reinvent the fighter plane from the ground up. They dreamed of a sleek, balanced, lethal machine that would destroy bombers with a single cannon blast and fly faster than anything the world had ever seen. Every choice they made was radical. The engine was moved behind the cockpit, mounted mid-fuselage like the heart of a race car. This freed the entire nose for a massive 37mm cannon, capable of punching through armor plate and igniting an enemy aircraft in one shot. The layout promised perfect weight distribution, the holy grail of flight stability. To drive the propeller from that rear engine, a 12-foot steel drive shaft ran beneath the pilot's seat, spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. The engineers swore it was safe. The test pilots were not so sure. Then came the tricycle landing gear, the first of its kind on an American fighter. It gave pilots better visibility on takeoff and prevented nose-overs during landings, but it looked wrong. Fighters were supposed to crouch on their tails, not stand upright like taxis on a runway. Inside, the cockpit was almost luxurious for its time. Car door entry panels, clear bubble canopy, clean instrument layout. Bell's sales brochures called it the pilot's fighter. And yet, the irony was cruel. The men it was built for hated it. In early test flights, the vibrations from that spinning driveshaft shook the entire airframe. Instruments blurred. Sight reticles danced. Gun accuracy was hopeless. When an engine failure occurred, the result was horrific. The propeller stopped, but the driveshaft often shattered, hurling fragments like shrapnel into the cockpit. A pilot who survived one such incident described it simply. "It exploded behind me. I thought my spine had been shot out." Worse still, the supercharger, the device that gave aircraft power at high altitudes, had been removed during redesign to save weight and cost. No one thought it mattered. America expected its next war to be short, defensive, and fought close to home. But when the P-39 finally met reality, the wide-open, freezing high-altitude skies of Europe, it failed instantly. British test squadrons received the first Airacobras in 1941. They were unimpressed. The engine gasped above 15,000 feet, the climb rate collapsed, and the cannon jammed after only a few rounds. The Royal Air Force cancelled its order within weeks. French units never got theirs before their country fell. By the time the United States entered the war, even its own pilots were begging to be reassigned. They called it the flying coffin. The phrase caught on. It appeared in mess hall jokes, on hangar walls, even in training letters sent home. "They gave us a new plane. It's beautiful, until you try to fly it." Yet deep inside the Bell factory, the engineers refused to surrender. They believed their machine was misunderstood, its genius unrecognized. They argued that in the right environment, the P-39 could still shine. They were right, but it would take a different sky, a different war, and a different kind of pilot to prove it. By the spring of 1942, the P-39 Airacobra had become an orphan of war. American squadrons refused to fly it. British units had returned theirs. Hangars across the United States were filling with gleaming aircraft that no one wanted. Each plane represented 60,000 man-hours of labour, 12,000 pounds of aluminum, and a dream that had turned to dust. And then came the telegram from Moscow. "We need aircraft, any aircraft." The words carried the weight of desperation. The Soviet Union, locked in a death struggle with Nazi Germany, was bleeding machines faster than it could build them. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies from Stalingrad to Leningrad. Factories lay in ruins, assembly lines burned, pilots fought in outdated biplanes against modern Messerschmitts. Stalin's message to Washington was clear: send us whatever you can spare. President Roosevelt had already promised to support the Soviets through the new Lend-Lease program, a logistical miracle designed to keep the Eastern Front alive. Tanks, trucks, ammunition, even food were already flowing across the Arctic convoys to Murmansk and through the Persian Gulf to the Caucasus. When US officials reviewed their aircraft inventory, they saw the Airacobra rose, unwanted, unassigned, unloved. It was the perfect candidate. Privately, some officers laughed. "If the Russians want airplanes, give them the ones we can't use," one procurement officer reportedly said. "They'll never know the difference." And so began one of the strangest journeys of the war. Disassembled Airacobras were loaded onto Liberty ships, their wings cratered and engines wrapped in oilcloth. Convoys left American ports for Basra, Iran, escorted by destroyers through U-boat-infested waters. From there, the crates travelled by rail and truck northward, through mountains and sandstorms until they reached Soviet territory. Each leg of the trip claimed casualties. Ships torpedoed, trains attacked, men lost. But still the shipments came. By late 1942, the first Bell P-39s were arriving at Soviet airfields near Baku and Astrakhan. Mechanics reassembled them in the snow. The American markings were painted over with red stars. The Soviet ground crews touched the metal, examining the tricycle gear, the strange mid-engine layout, the massive nose cannon. Their first impressions were skeptical. The aircraft looked heavy, overcomplicated, and clumsy compared to their familiar Yak-1s and Lig-G3s. One pilot reportedly muttered, "Only Americans would put an engine behind the pilot." But there was no time for ridicule. The Germans were bombing the Volga bridges daily. Pilots died faster than replacements could arrive. The Red Air Force needed wings, any wings, and so, reluctantly, the flying coffin was prepared for combat under a new sky. When the first Airacobras lifted from the frozen airstrips of southern Russia, they carried more than fuel and ammunition. They carried irony, an American failure reborn as a Soviet experiment. No one knew it yet, but in those cold cockpits sat the men who would turn mockery into legend. Southern Russia, autumn 1942. The wind smelled of dust and kerosene. German Stukas howled across the plains, their sirens shrieking as they dove on Soviet positions. Anti-aircraft fire clawed at the clouds, too slow, too few. On the ground, a new sound began to rise, a deeper metallic roar, unlike anything the Red Army soldiers had heard before. Out of the low horizon came 6 P-39 Airacobras, freshly painted in olive drab, the red star still glossy on their tails. Their tricycle gear retracted. Their nose cannons gleamed. Inside, the pilots gripped unfamiliar American controls, feeling the strange vibration of the drive shaft beneath their feet. Among them was Senior Lieutenant Grigory Rechkalov, 21 years old, flying his first combat sortie in the foreign machine. He had been skeptical. Everyone had. The manuals were in English. The cockpit labels were gibberish. The instructors had told them only one thing: keep it low and dive hard. Ahead, a formation of German Ju-88 bombers lumbered toward the front line, escorted by Bf-109s circling above. Rechkalov pushed the throttles forward. The twin-bladed propeller screamed. The Airacobra surged ahead, heavier than the Yak he'd flown before, but astonishingly stable. The stick felt solid. The view through the canopy was wide, almost panoramic. He rolled into attack. The 37mm cannon in the nose barked once, just once, and a Ju-88 disintegrated mid-air, its tail sheared clean away. The recoil kicked the whole aircraft upward, but Rechkalov's grin split beneath his oxygen mask. "The cannon is magnificent," he would write that night. 3 shells, 1 bomber destroyed. The American machine is heavy, but it dives like a stone. It rewards aggression and punishes hesitation. The other pilots learned fast. They discovered that at low altitude, where the Eastern Front battles raged, the P-39's weaknesses vanished. Its Allison engine breathed perfectly in the dense air. Its weight made it rock steady in the dive. The Germans, used to fighting at 20,000 feet, found themselves dragged into knife fights at treetop height. The first month changed everything. Squadrons that had struggled to stay alive suddenly began reporting victories. The Airacobra could take hits that would shatter a wooden Soviet fighter. It could roll, dive, and climb back out again with frightening speed. German Stukas, slow, arrogant, used to immunity, began falling from the sky in flames. Reports from frontline units reached Moscow. The American plane performs excellently below 3,000 meters. Cannon effective against bombers and tanks. Pilots request additional P-39 shipments. The message stunned US attachés in the Kremlin. The flying coffin had become a weapon of choice. At Stalingrad, Airacobras prowled the river valleys, strafing German armor columns at point-blank range. Their heavy nose cannons blew through tank turrets. Their machine guns shredded convoys. One Soviet squadron commander called them "iron sharks of the low sky." For the first time since 1941, Soviet pilots felt the tide shift. They were no longer prey, they were hunters. The P-39 had found its element and its people. By 1943, the Eastern Front was a furnace. From Kursk to the Kuban, the air shimmered with the heat of summer and the stench of burning oil. The German Luftwaffe still outnumbered the Soviets and still held technical superiority at high altitude. But that mattered less and less. Because down in the thick, violent air of the steppe, the P-39 Airacobra had found its master. His name was Alexander Ivanovich Pokrishkin. He was 30 years old, sharp-eyed, precise, a man who believed that every battle could be solved like an equation. He had started the war flying the slow, fragile MiG-3, watching friends die around him while German fighters shredded the sky. When he first saw the P-39, he studied it not as a machine, but as a question. Why had the Americans failed with it? Why did his own pilots, crude and undertrained, find it natural? He took it apart mentally. The heavy nose, the rear engine, the low-altitude power curve, the thick armour around the cockpit, the devastating 37mm cannon that could obliterate a bomber in one hit. The answer, he realised, was simple. The Airacobra was not a duelist. It was an ambusher. From this revelation, Pokrishkin developed what he called his formula of air combat. It wasn't poetry. It was mathematics. Altitude plus speed plus maneuver plus fire = victory. It meant control. Don't waste energy turning like a fool. Climb first. Dive fast. Strike once. Get out alive. If the enemy forces you into a slow circle fight, he wins. If you force him into your calculated geometry of death, you win. Pokrishkin taught this to his squadron, the 16th Guards Fighter Regiment, with the rigour of a schoolteacher. He drew diagrams on chalkboards, carved angles in the dirt with a stick, lectured in tents late into the night. And his pilots listened, because he wasn't just a theorist, he was a killer. At Kuban, the proving ground of Soviet air tactics, Pokrishkin's regiment took to the skies in their olive P-39s and changed everything. Instead of charging head-on, they attacked from above at high speed, using short bursts of cannon fire and immediately rolling out into vertical dives. The Germans were stunned. Their Bf-109s, optimized for tight turns, suddenly found themselves being hit from impossible angles and never seeing the enemy's face. Day after day, Pokrishkin refined the system. He measured results, adjusted altitude bands, tested ammunition loads. Each success hardened into data, each data point into doctrine. By summer 1943, Soviet Fighter Command had formally adopted his formula. Pokrishkin himself had become legend. His Airacobra, marked with white nose art and twin kill lines, was known to both sides. German radio chatter warned, "Achtung, Pokrishkin in der Luft." Attention, Pokrishkin is in the air. To be sighted by him was often a death sentence. He preferred short, devastating strikes. Ambush from above, one burst, one kill, gone before the enemy even reacted. Within months, his victory count climbed past 20, then 30, then 40. He never boasted. When a reporter once asked him what made him great, he replied quietly, "I am not great. The formula is great." Under his command, the Airacobra ceased to be an American embarrassment. It became the cutting edge of Soviet air power, a precision instrument wielded by thinkers, not daredevils. By the time of the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank and air engagement in history, Pokrishkin's regiments dominated the low-altitude skies. The once derided American fighter was now the hammer that broke the Luftwaffe's back. And through it all, he kept one photograph in his pocket, the original American manual, the words, "Not recommended for combat," underlined in red. Every time he looked at it, he smiled. By 1944, the Soviet pilots of the P-39 Airacobra had earned a new nickname from their enemies, the Iron Men of the Low Sky. It wasn't a compliment, it was a warning. They flew in weather that grounded the Luftwaffe, snowstorms, sleet, fog thick enough to erase the horizon. They flew without radios, sometimes navigating by rivers, rail lines, or the colour of the smoke rising from distant cities. They flew because if they didn't, the Red Army would die below them. Their cockpits were saunas in summer, ice boxes in winter. Frost formed on the glass inside the canopy, oil congealed in the guns. They carried sidearms not for glory, but because if their engines failed, the Germans would find them alive. And yet they flew, again and again. Each mission was a ritual of fatigue. Mechanics fueled the aircraft with frostbitten hands. The pilots lit cigarettes with shaking fingers. The sound of the Allison engine became the rhythm of their lives. A deep, metallic heartbeat echoing through endless days of smoke and noise. Among them were names that would become immortal: Pokrishkin, Rechkalov, Glinka, Golodnikov. Men so different in temperament, yet united by the same unbreakable hunger, not for medals, but for survival with dignity. Their relationship with the Airacobra was intimate and brutal. They called it Kobrushka, Little Cobra. They joked that it had an American soul but a Russian temper. It demanded respect, mishandle it, and it would kill you faster than the enemy could. But treat it right, and it would become invincible. Every pilot knew its quirks by heart: the lag in the controls when inverted, the heat of the cannon barrel after 3 rounds, the way the vibration shifted tone just before the propeller pitch adjusted. To outsiders, they looked like lunatics flying foreign scrap metal. To each other, they were craftsmen, engineers of instinct. Pokrishkin's regiment developed its own rituals. Before takeoff, they would tap the nose of the aircraft twice for luck, mutter, "For the motherland," and close the canopy with the sound of finality. They no longer feared the Luftwaffe, only mechanical failure. By mid-1944, Pokrishkin's unit alone had destroyed more than 500 German aircraft. His personal score approached 50 victories. The Airacobra's cannon thundered across the Kuban, the Dniester, the Carpathians, wherever the Red Army advanced. But the cost was written in faces and silence. The Iron Men rarely spoke after missions. They cleaned their goggles, sipped their vodka, and stared into the distance, as if replaying every near-death moment in their minds. They had learned what every ace eventually learns, that mastery of flight is really mastery of fear. They were not heroes in the American sense. No parades, no applause. They were tools, sharpened by war until nothing human remained but endurance. And yet, beneath the iron, something else survived: pride, because they knew what the rest of the world didn't, that the aircraft the Americans had mocked, the one their own countrymen had refused to fly, was now the backbone of Soviet victory in the air. The flying coffin had become their sword, and the Iron Men of the low sky were its living edge. By late 1944, the Airacobra was no longer a curiosity. It was a workhorse, a veteran, and a symbol. Its shark-nosed silhouette a familiar sight across the liberated skies of Eastern Europe. Soviet children cheered when they saw one overhead. German pilots cursed when they did. At the Bell factory in Buffalo, the assembly lines still clattered day and night, producing Airacobras that would never fly under the American flag. Out of the 9,500 aircraft built, more than half, nearly 5,000, went east, painted with red stars. Each one carried across oceans and deserts, through convoys stalked by U-boats, to land on the cracked concrete of Soviet airfields. The irony was breathtaking. The airplane America didn't want had become the aircraft that kept Russia alive. By the spring of 1945, when the Red Army thundered into Berlin, Airacobras were still there, strafing German columns, smashing artillery lines, dueling the last desperate remnants of the Luftwaffe over the ruins of the Reich. Photographs from those final weeks show them lined up on muddy airstrips, engines still warm, their cockpits streaked with soot and blood. Pokrishkin's unit led the victory flyover above Prague. The crowd below saw sleek fighters, unaware that these were the same flying coffins the West had laughed at just 3 years earlier. When the war ended, Bell Aircraft began building its successor, the P-63 King Cobra, a refined version of the same design. But the men who had truly understood the original were thousands of miles away, flying home over scorched forests, exhausted and triumphant. In Buffalo, a foreman walked through a hangar full of unsent P-39s, their canopies fogged, their tires cracking from age. He'd read the combat reports. Soviets claim 9-to-1 kill ratio. Pokrishkin ace of aces, Airacobra decisive in low-altitude warfare. He touched the nose of one aircraft and whispered, almost to himself, "So you were never broken, just misplaced." Across the world, in Moscow, the surviving Iron Men of the Guards regiments gathered in a small hall for a ceremony. Pokrishkin, Rechkolov, and their comrades received the Hero of the Soviet Union medals. When asked to name the aircraft that had carried them through war, Pokrishkin simply replied, "The American Cobra, but the Russian Spirit." The Aerocobra's story ended not with applause, but with understanding. Its failure had been one of context, not design. Given to the wrong sky, it was a coffin. Given to the right men, it became a legend. That is the quiet tragedy of innovation. Success is not always born where it's invented. Sometimes history has to exile a creation before it finds its purpose. Every war invents its own truths. One side's failure becomes another's miracle. One nation's scrap metal becomes another's salvation. The Airacobra was never a perfect machine. It shook, it burned, it frightened its own test pilots. But perfection has never won a war. People have. And in the hands of men who understood its flaws as intimately as their own weaknesses, it became something greater than the sum of its parts. When the Americans built it, they dreamed of altitude, clean skies, jewels of elegance and science. When the Soviets received it, they dreamed of survival, dirty skies, dust and fire and instinct. Between those two visions, the aircraft found its soul. The Aerocobra's journey reminds us that success is not a straight line, but a transformation, forged in translation, baptized by failure, redeemed in hands that refuse to surrender. In the right sky, with the right hearts, even a coffin can become a sword, and somewhere over the Russian steppe, the wind still carries the echo of its cannon, the sound of an unwanted machine flown by Iron Men, rewriting the physics of survival.